It is easy to feel overwhelmed whenever the storms of life hit us, or discouraged as we fight against the continual pull of the world. Sometimes we even feel as if we are the only ones going through such difficult times. And whenever we feel all alone, it is possible to feel as if there is no one in this world who can help us. Or we can feel as if there is no one who has ever experienced or was ever victorious over such things as we face. These are very dangerous waters for us to be in. For if we allow ourselves to think in this way, it is an easy next step for us to use our situations as an excuse for not always doing what is right. Rather than choosing the path of right, we can justify our sinning by saying that it's just too difficult. However, the reality is that there have been many faithful people who have gone before us and have shown us what faithfulness through such difficult times has looked like. And even though the specifics of our situations are quite likely different from theirs, we can still learn from their faithfulness. In fact, the reality is that some of these faithful men and women have paved roads of faithful living through far more difficult circumstances than we have ever experienced or may ever experience. We can and should learn from their faithfulness in these times so that we can make the applications to our current struggles on this earth. For instance, Hebrews chapter 12 and verses 1 and 2 says, "Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." As Paul uses the illustration of running a race, we think about how easy it is to get partway into a marathon and have discouragement kick in. The temptation to stop running and not push toward the finish line can be strong, especially as other obstacles can creep into the picture. But as you and I struggle through our earthly lives and try to remain faithful to the Lord, the Hebrew writer pictures this great cloud of witnesses. As I understand it, the picture is one of a great crowd of spectators who are watching you and I run our races of faith, and they are cheering us on to victory. And then as you look around this crowd, you notice something very special about it. There are many faces in this crowd that are familiar to you. They include Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Rahab, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and many, many others who have completed their races and demonstrated faith to us. Now, as they cheer you on to victory through the storms and the current of this life, you are emboldened and heartened to endure your struggles in life. Set aside all the sin that hinders you and finish the race. And if that was not enough, as you look toward the finish line, you see Jesus. He is the perfect example for you as you face obstacles in your life. Jesus overcame so much and paved the way for you to be saved. Now you must keep your eyes focused on Him, straining to see Him through all of the distractions of life that are around you constantly. For you know that He endured even the cross. For the joy that was set before Him, now He is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. In this lesson, we want to find encouragement from those people who are in the stands. They will help us keep our eyes focused on Jesus. For they have endured some of the greatest storms ever to be faced on this earth and fought against the same current that we fight against, and sometimes even a stronger current than we face. But they all faced this with faith. So as we look into our text of Hebrews chapter 11 and prepare to study a few examples given in this chapter, we notice that God gives us a definition of what faith is in verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith provides the assurance that what we hope for will not disappoint us, even though we do not see it. And therefore, when we are strong in faith, we will hold securely to our anchor, which is the hope of eternal salvation through Jesus Christ. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 19. Let's begin with Noah. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, it says, "By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith." Let's learn from this champion of faith who is cheering for you and me as we try to live faithfully throughout our earthly lives. You know, as wicked as the world around you may seem to be, know that it is not any worse than when Noah was living. The reality is that if anyone could have felt all alone in a world full of wickedness, it would have been Noah. Although I don't have any idea how many people inhabited the world at the time Noah lived, I do know how few there are who pleased God and how vast the wickedness was. In Genesis chapter 6 and verses 5 through 7, it says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them." Can you imagine trying to live in a world that could be described in this way? The wickedness was so great that God wanted to wipe out his creation from the earth. It was not just that man sinned frequently. The text says that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So this was complete wickedness all of the time. And as God searched for those who were faithful to him, there were not many to choose from. The only ones God found to be pleasing to him were Noah and Noah's family. Verse 8 says, "Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." Besides these 8 people, there was no one who was righteous. And God was so angry at this wickedness that God determined to destroy mankind by means of a flood, only to save Noah and his family. Now just imagine being Noah at this time. 2 Peter 2 and verse 5 describes Noah as a preacher of righteousness and one of 8 people who would be saved. As Noah tried to live his life for the Lord and teach his family to do the right things, don't you suppose that it would have often been discouraging for him? Don't you suppose that he may have felt disheartened whenever he tried to preach to the people about the right ways of God and no one ever listened outside of his family? Don't you think he probably felt the entire world trying to pull him away from God and into wickedness? Yet Noah obeyed God because of his faith. Whenever God told Noah that he was going to destroy the world by means of a flood, and that Noah needed to make an ark of gopher wood according to a specific pattern God revealed to him, Noah obeyed. Genesis 6 and verse 22 says, "Thus Noah did, according to all that God commanded him, so he did." Regardless of the pressure that was put on him by the outside world that was full of wickedness, Noah chose to be different and live for God. Just imagine being Noah while he was trying to build the ark. Do you suppose that the wicked people around him were ridiculing him even as he was trying to preach righteousness to them so that they could be saved? Still, he built the ark according to all of God's specifications. And then the Lord said to Noah in Genesis 7 and verse 1, "Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." Noah had been successful in remaining faithful to God, even though the pull of the world against him was as strong as it has ever been for anyone. But why did Noah remain faithful to God during this time of great wickedness on the earth? Hebrews 11 verse 7 gives us the answer. Even though the things God said were going to happen had not yet happened, Noah had faith in God. He had faith in God in at least 2 ways. He had faith in God that God was able to flood the whole world, and he had faith in God that God was able to save him and his family if they remained faithful to him. So moved with godly fear, Noah prepared the ark according to God's specifications. He kept his focus on what God had promised and would not give in to the pull of the world. And thus, Noah had full confidence that God really would save him and his family from the wickedness of the world, and held firmly to that anchor through the difficult times that led up to the flood. Second, I want you to think about Abraham as we try to learn from champions. In Hebrews 11, in verses 8 through 10, it says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, and heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God." And then in Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19, it says, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, 'In Isaac your seed shall be called,' concluding that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense." Let's learn from this champion of faith, who is cheering for you and me as we try to live faithfully throughout our earthly lives. As difficult of the tests that you may face in your life, you have likely never faced tests of the same degree that Abraham faced in his life. If anyone could have decided that the tests of his life were just too much to demonstrate faith through, it would have been Abraham. However, throughout his life on this earth, Abraham demonstrated that he had full confidence in God. Specifically, the Hebrew writer calls our attention to two specific tests Abraham faced. First, God called him to leave his homeland in order to go to a land that God promised to give to Abraham's descendants. In Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, records the call that the Lord gave to him. Now the Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Abraham had a choice to make. He could choose to obey God and leave the comforts of his home and his family to go to this new land, or he could choose to remain in the land of his family. And then there's an added layer of difficulty in this test. Recognize that the promises God was making to Abraham about this land were dependent on Abraham having descendants of his own. Yet at 75 years old, Abraham was still childless. Then a second test Abraham faced was the sacrifice God called him to make. After God blessed Abraham and Sarah, his wife, with a son in their old age, God commanded Abraham to take his only son, Isaac, and sacrifice him. Genesis 22 and verse 2 says that God told Abraham, "Take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Not only would this have been an unimaginably difficult task to do as a father, but this was also the son God was supposed to fulfill all his other promises through. Once again, Abraham faced a decision that must be made in his life. He could either choose to obey God and offer his only son as a sacrifice, or he could choose to disobey God and rely on his own human reasoning. Yet Abraham obeyed God because of his faith. It is interesting that in the verses following both of these great tests, Abraham does not even waver in making a decision. For instance, after God called Abraham to leave his homeland, Genesis 12 and verse 4 says, "So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him." And then after God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Genesis 22 and verse 3 says, "So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. How difficult it must have been from a physical perspective to split the wood that you expected to be used in offering your son. How difficult it must have been from a physical perspective to pack up all your belongings and go to a place that is away from home and family. But faith made all of these difficult actions possible. Hebrews 11 demonstrates Abraham's great faith through these 2 tests. As Abraham journeyed to this land that was foreign to him, Hebrews 11 verse 10 reveals that he was actually waiting for the heavenly city, whose builder and maker is God. Hebrews chapter 11 verses 13 through 16 teaches that Abraham viewed himself as a stranger and pilgrim on this earth, one who was seeking a better, that is, a heavenly country. He was fully convinced that God would provide him with this much better land if he would choose the path of faithfulness in his life. And then whenever he was tested to offer a son, Hebrews 11 demonstrates Abraham's great faith that God would fulfill his promises to him in some way. Even though the earthly circumstances looked dimmed, hope shined brightly for Abraham whenever he looked through the eye of faith in God. He even concluded that God was able to raise Isaac up from the dead in order to fulfill his promises, Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19. He was so fully convinced that God would provide some answer for this test that he set his hope in God and acted by faith that God was able to make a way for him. Next, we want to learn from Joseph. Hebrews 11, verse 22 says, "By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones." Let's learn from this champion of faith who is cheering for you and me as we try to live faithfully throughout our earthly lives. Joseph's story takes up many chapters in the book of Genesis, from chapter 37 through chapter 50, and takes many different twists and turns. And this was a very difficult road for Joseph throughout his life. Surely if anyone could have lost his faith in God or blamed God and grown bitter throughout his life, it was Joseph. Yet even in his dying words, he expressed the same kind of faith that characterized his life. Whenever we're introduced to Joseph as a primary character of the book of the Genesis record, we see a young man of 17 years old. He was the envy of 10 of his brothers and the favorite son of his father, Jacob. After Joseph was given a special coat of many colors from his father and dreamed that his brothers and father would bow before him one day, these 10 brothers had enough. They decided that they would kill Joseph. However, with one brother talking them out of killing him, he was put into a pit. What Joseph must have been thinking when he was down in this pit, not knowing what his brothers would do to him. Then he was sold into slavery when a company of Ishmaelites came by. What Joseph must have been thinking when he was traveling with this country, not knowing what would happen next. Then he was sold to an Egyptian man named Potiphar. What Joseph must have been thinking to find himself alone in a strange land as a very young man. And then his master's wife kept trying to get him to commit adultery with her. But when he refused, he was accused of forcing himself on her, and her husband had Joseph imprisoned. What Joseph must have been thinking when he was in prison in a strange land for doing the right thing. And then when Joseph interpreted a dream for the chief butler of Pharaoh and told him that he would be restored to his position in 3 days, the butler forgot about Joseph for a period of 2 years. What Joseph must have been thinking while he remained in prison and did not hear anything from the butler or Pharaoh. Yet Joseph obeyed God because of his faith. Now, it's easy for us to read the story of Joseph and know how the story turns out, with Joseph being elevated to second in command over Egypt and being used to save his family from a great famine. But Joseph did not know how these things would turn out. Still, we see Joseph demonstrating faithfulness to God at every point in his life. The circumstances with Potiphar's wife provide an excellent example of this faithfulness. As a young man in a strange land, he could have decided to act with wickedness. After all, surely none of his family would find out about what he had done. Yet in refusing to commit adultery with his master's wife, he told her, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Genesis 39, verses 8 and 9. He knew that God saw everything that he did at every point in his life, and he determined that he would place his full trust in God. As a result, God made him prosper and used him to preserve his people during a great time of famine. It was not until some time later that in his life that he fully understood what God had done through him. He told his brothers in Genesis 50 and verse 20, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about, as it is this day, to save many people alive." And then when Joseph was 110 years old, Joseph demonstrated faith in his dying words, as referenced by the Hebrew writer. Knowing the promises that God had made to his fathers concerning the land of Canaan, Joseph said that God will surely visit and bring the Israelites out of the land of Egypt and to the land of which he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. Genesis 50, verse 24. Then he took an oath from the children of Israel that they would carry his bones out of Egypt. Genesis 50, verse 25. And thus Joseph was absolutely convinced that God was able to bring them out of Egypt and give them the land he had promised to the fathers. Next, let's learn from Moses. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23 through 29 says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned." Let's learn from this champion of faith, who is cheering for you and me as we try to live faithfully throughout our earthly lives. If anyone could have attempted to justify rejecting God in order to enjoy the pleasures that were offered to him by the world, it would have been Moses. For Moses was in a very unique position to experience worldly pleasures. His story begins during a time when the Pharaoh had commanded all of the male Israelite children to be cast into the river and drowned. Yet his parents acted by faith and refused to allow their child to be killed. Whenever they hid baby Moses in the bulrushes, it happened that Pharaoh's daughter came to that place to bathe in the river, and one of her maidens discovered the baby. Pharaoh's daughter had compassion on Moses and had his own mother nurse him. And then after Moses grew, he was brought to Pharaoh's daughter and became her son. Now just imagine what Moses had access to as the adopted grandson of the king of Egypt. The Hebrew writer helps us to recognize that Moses had access to the treasures in Egypt, verse 26, and pleasures of sin, verse 25. Perhaps he would have had all the wealth that he could have hoped for. Perhaps he could have had any earthly desire granted whenever he wanted. Perhaps he could have lived in a great palace. Perhaps he could have experienced great fame. Perhaps he could have had opportunity to excel as a military leader for the powerful Egyptian army. Perhaps he could have rose on the ladder of Egyptian politics. Perhaps he was even heir to this king. Although we don't know exactly what kinds of earthly treasures and pleasures Moses was in line to experience, they were definitely present. And Moses had a choice to make. He could forget about his actual Israelite ancestry and forget about God in order to enjoy these earthly pleasures and treasures. Or he could give them all up in order to live in a different kind of way entirely. Certainly, if most people were faced with this choice, they would choose to experience the earthly pleasures and treasures. And I find it difficult to believe that Moses was not tempted to do the same. On one hand was a life of ease, luxury, and pleasure. On the other hand was suffering, affliction with the people of God. Yet Moses obeyed God because of his faith. Whenever Moses became of age, he made a firm decision that would change the trajectory of his life on earth, as well as, presumably, the future home of his soul. The Hebrew writer plainly states that because of his faith, he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Verses 24 and 25. But why was his faith so strong to cause him to make this decision? Once again, the Hebrew writer provides the answer. First, notice that he states the pleasures of sin were only passing, verse 25. So the best that Moses would experience in the land of Egypt during his earthly life was only temporary, and Moses recognized this fact. And then as Moses compared the life he would experience living in Egypt and living for God, he considered the reproach of Christ greater riches than all the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Verse 26. Now, I really don't know what Moses understood about life after death, but this is evidence that Moses recognized there was more to life than what you can experience on this earth. In fact, Moses recognized that the pleasurable things a person can experience on this earth are only temporary and pale in comparison to the riches and reward that awaits those who serve God. So his hope in such a future reward anchored his soul so that he made the decision to serve God in his life rather than live for his own earthly pleasures. And then, even after making this initial decision, Moses continued a life of faithfulness and service to God and leading the people of God out of Egypt. Even though the king of Egypt was powerful, Moses forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. He kept the Passover and passed through the Red Sea, verse 27. But again, why was Moses willing to put his physical life in such jeopardy? Hebrews 11, verse 27 tells us that these actions were taken by faith and because Moses saw him who is invisible. So rather than seeing the power of the king of Egypt, Moses saw the power of the King of Kings who dwells in heaven. And Moses trusted enough in this king to obey him, even when it required him to make sacrifices during his earthly life and do things that seemed improbable from an earthly perspective. Next, we want to learn from some others that Hebrews 11 talks about in verses 30 through 40. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe, when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, and also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony, through faith did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Let's learn from these champions of faith who are cheering for you and me as we try to live faithfully throughout our earthly lives. If people could have had reason to give up on God and fail to survive the storms and current of life, surely it would have been these people. Some of these people are unknown to us by name, yet we know that the Bible is full of examples of faithfulness through extremely difficult and challenging circumstances. Can you imagine facing the kinds of struggles that these people faced? Think about Gideon going up against a mighty and innumerable army with 300 men. Think of the prophets of God who proclaimed God's word to wicked people even when they were killed and punished for doing so. Think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they were about to be cast into the fiery furnace because they would not bow before an idol. Think about Daniel when he was about to be cast into the lion's den because he prayed to God. Surely there are many Old Testament stories that demonstrate many of the things mentioned by the Hebrew writer in this section. Think about the apostles of Jesus Christ. Think about how severely they were persecuted for preaching the gospel of Christ throughout the world. Think about how all but one of these experienced martyrdom, according to a combination of biblical and secular history. And think about how the Apostle John, even though it is not believed that he was martyred, how he experienced persecution and exile for the Lord's cause. Then think about the early Christians. Although the Hebrew writer may not have been alluding to them, they experienced many of these same kinds of hardships. For instance, during the time of the Roman Empire, Christians would experience some of the worst and most widespread persecution that has ever been known to mankind. The Roman emperors would even refine their cruelty in order to devise new ways of torturing those who followed Jesus Christ. Much of this is pictured in the book of Revelation in symbolic language. They were separated from their families, left destitute, put into prisons, tortured, and killed in inhumane ways. Yet all of these obeyed God because of their faith. I want you to imagine being faced with the prospects of some of the things these people faced. Being fed to lions, violence of fire, being slain by the sword, being tortured, being put through a mocking trial and scourgings, which were severe beatings that many people did not survive, being confined by chains of imprisonment, being stoned, being sawn in two, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, and wandering about in sheepskins and goatskins, wandering in deserts, mountains, dens, and caves. Surely none of this is what we hope to experience during our earthly lives. But this is the severity of some storms that some have faced. Yet their mention in this chapter of Hebrews indicates that they remain faithful through all of these storms. I think verse 35 is very helpful in understanding the thinking of these people and should serve as an encouragement to us as we run our races. The author says, others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they may obtain a better resurrection. Just imagine being tortured for your faith in God and living according to His laws. And then as you're being tortured, you're given an offer to be delivered from it. If you will renounce your faith and no longer serve God or teach His commandments to others, would you accept that deliverance? These people did not. And they did not accept the offer because they had an anchor of hope for a better resurrection that would make all of their sufferings worthwhile. So while we could study each one of these points and consider some Old Testament accounts of faith for many of them, we are impressed by the collective faith that has been demonstrated in this section of Scripture. And these all died in faith without even having access to the better promises that God has given to us today as part of His new covenant. Surely we should act with an even stronger faith, now that we have heard the better promises that have been given to those who are in Christ Jesus. As you think about the things that you have been through in your life, as bad as they may be, you should consider whether they top anything that these people in Hebrews 11 experienced. But even if they begin to compare with some of the people we have been studying about, they surely do not compare to Jesus Christ, who was tortured and put to death even though He had committed no sin. Therefore, as we try to navigate the stormy waters of life and remain faithful, remain steadfast against the current, we should look to and learn from these great champions of faith. They truly demonstrate that faith will overcome the world and lead us to victory through Jesus Christ, who has overcome the world. 1 John 5, verses 4 and 5. We must always remember that without faith it is impossible to please Him, that is, to please God. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. Hebrews 11, verse 6. Allow all of these great champions of faith to strengthen, encourage, and embolden you as you keep your eyes fixed on Jesus while pressing toward the finish line. If they could be victorious in their faith, so can you through Jesus Christ. Philippians 4, verse 13 says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.